Thank you, everyone. I've got the music stand here because in my previous life, I was a conductor. I want to tell you about why I'm a publisher. In 2003, I moved to Nigeria to become a research fellow at a university. I planned to spend the next few years researching about Yoruba women's ideas and experience of love and desire. But as I was moving around people's homes, I was puzzled by the bookshelves I saw. Sadly, many of them were empty. When they were not empty, they had books like religious books, Bibles, Quran, or self-help motivational books with titles like A Purpose-Driven Life, Chicken Soup for the Soul. Or when they had fiction, they had Dan Brown or John Grisham. I thought to myself, you can hardly build a civilization or feed the imagination on a diet of John Grisham or Dan Brown. I wondered why Amos Utola, Buche Mecheta, Mariamba, Bessie Head, Ben Okri were absent from the bookshelves. It was these emptied of spirit bookshelves that became the inspiration for setting up Cassava Republic Press and for curating what I'm calling the African archival future, which will contribute to the global archive of ideas. The mantra that Africans must tell their own stories is a familiar one, and we have heard that story here today or throughout this week. But do we ever pause to think about those people who might be behind building the infrastructure, behind the scenes, that enable us for Africans to tell their stories? We don't. Do we ever think about the challenges they may be facing? We don't. And I could tell you about the challenges. I could tell you about when I first started, naively going ahead and printing 20,000 copies, when most publishers would print 1,000 copies. But I'm Nigerian, so we think big. I could tell you, and those 20,000, by the way, we had to destroy them because they were terrible. I could talk about a container load of books waiting in warehouse at the port for months and months because we refused to pay a fictional duty. I could talk about how for many, many years I spent most of Cassava's history in bed because my body just wouldn't do what it's supposed to do. I could also tell you about booksellers who refused to pay for books they had sold or who suddenly went bankrupt. I could also tell you about generous hosts who hosted authors in their homes or a businessman who gave us a free warehouse to warehouse all our books. I could tell you about a woman from Ebonyi State who found out about us and decided to donate 500 copies of our books to libraries in her state because for one reason she wanted to support a female-owned business. I could tell you about how gratifying it is now, 10 years on, to see more Nigerian schools with books by African authors. I could also brag about the innovation we brought into Nigerian publishing industry, which enabled us to sell 3 million copies of a single book rather than lose that revenue to pirates, which is the norm in Nigeria. 80% of books that are published in Nigeria gets lost to piracy. But what I really want to talk about is why I've chosen the path of publishing and building an infrastructure for authors rather than continuing the academic pursuit. The reason is that I think book and book publishing is one of the most important and the most powerful archival technologies we have. We've been talking about building the future, but we need things that would enable us to remember today for the future. The archive, if we think about it, is where we store the things we want to remember or the things we want to think about. Yet, the archive is where we store things we want to remember for the future. But yet, when we think about the archive, we think of it in the past. We say we're going into the archive as if we're going somewhere into the past. We rarely consciously think of the fact that every moment, every Facebook update that we waste away, every email exchange, every cultural production, every scientific discovery, every dance movement is an opportunity in the present to create and contribute to the archive of the future. If we think that we're contributing to the archive of the future, I think we'll behave differently in the present. I think the archive is very powerful. However, the archive is not value-free. It is always imbued with power, presence, and erasure. As an African feminist, I'm acutely aware of the violence and injustice of the archive, whether from the colonial records or the European musings about Africans and Africa, and also from Africa's own oral narratives and philosophies and mythologies, all of which have provided the template for how we are seen and how we see ourselves. This is why I think publishing is important to me, and I want to contribute to the archive and erasure and ensure that African story is not always owned by the West or left up to African men alone. We have seen what happened with African writing and publishing under Achebe as editorial advisor for the very powerful African Writers series. When Achebe was in charge of the African Writers series as the editorial advisor, of the 26 books they published, only one woman was published, and that was in 1960. It took them 26 books to publish one woman. And then the second time a woman was published was after the 101 book. Okay? So my hope is that in 100, 300, and perhaps 500 years' time, when people search back to our time, this will be different. And what they will find in the archive will be determined by what we produce and create and document today. And they will find a diverse array of texts written, produced, and owned by Africans. I always say that if we don't like what the script that is before us, there's nothing stopping us, absolutely nothing stopping us from writing or rewriting the script and the vision that we want to see. The 20th century is a century of African men of letters, and we're going to allow them. But the 21st century, the 22nd, the 23rd, and the 24th certainly will be African women of letters, because I'm there, and there are more African women in publishing. So when I think about the decisions I'm making today and the books I choose to publish, I think to myself, I'm going to be contributing to how we think about morality, sexuality, ethics, even food. And that makes me feel both powerful and humbled. It also forces me to be more deliberate about the choice of text and topics that I choose to publish, rather than leave it for the future, leave it to chance. So who then today is turning the invisible aspects of our lives into visibility? Who's helping us to reimagine our mundane existence and turning it into poetry? Who's disrupting our thought processes and twisting the shapes of words? Who's helping us to think about a new model of desire? Who will then make sense of the complex and complicated, sophisticated webs of our countless mythologies? Who will force us to confront stunning poverty and abjection and simultaneously wrap us in a blanket of humor, desire, and aliveness? And the answer is always our writers, our cultural producers, historians, philosophers, etc. They are collecting fragments of our lives and putting them together. When people in the future look into the archive for stories, for example, about queer realities today, they will not find empty shelves like we have found. They will find titles like Some Girls Want Wives, by Zina and Chitra, or When We Speak of Nothing. They will find books such as Lives of Great Men, sitting alongside whatever they have created. They will know about what it meant to live as a queer person in Africa under the influence of retrogressive Abrahamic religions. When they look back today, and they're looking for evidence of whether women of 75-year-olds could possibly be sexually aroused, they will find a book like A Mule Bringing Ice Cream to the Sun. Or when they're looking for sophistication of Nigerian food cuisine, they will find a book like Long Throat Memoir by Yemisi Aribisala. But producing culture and writing is not enough. Africans must do more than that. We must own the means of production, and we must develop our own platform. The person who owns the means of production really does control the narrative. Writers may tell their stories, but whoever owns the means of production or the platforms is going to direct how the stories will be received. So it's really important that we control that narrative as well as control the means of production. When I think about the text that I have allowed for people to see in the future, it makes me feel confident, and it also makes me feel grateful for what went before. Because people will no longer have a sense of inferiority complex or be plagued by the anxiety that we are plagued today, because we are constantly looking for validation from America or Europe. By owning the platform, I can help curate a future archive and show future Africans that their history was not one long, continuous darkness, but rather it is the source code for their own future curation. They can now add to what we have left to them. And that would mean that those future people will exercise, that would mean that the future people will have to think bigger. They will have to have more ambition about how they want to live their lives and the choices they want to make. Because let's remember, civilization is always built on excess, and it's the excess of imagination, not timidity, that builds civilization. This is why I'm a publisher. Thank you.